The Beatles! That's lovely music, that is, lads. Lovely. The Beatles with Revolution. A little bit of revolution now and then is a good thing, I suppose. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Part 2 of Unit 4, talking about some groups that were looking to change American society. We start off with talking about the Mormons. The Mormons, in many ways, were right in the traditional mainstream of America. They practiced patriarchy, male-supervised society. They also believed in a good, strong capitalist ideal. I think that helps them in this growing age of American economics to be so thrifty and so driven towards individual profit. And in some ways, they were kind of different from American society. Their ideals of polygamy certainly challenged traditional American values on marriage, and also their ideas about block voting, showing up in big groups and voting, especially in Illinois, in places in large enough numbers to sway the vote toward them. That made them highly unpopular. Also the fact that they had a different interpretation of the Christian vision. That makes for a very different interpretation, and as a result of it, gains them scorn within society. Some of the early leaders, Joseph Smith. It's Smith who puts together the Book of Mormon, who leads the movement through its early days, a lot of the days of persecution in Missouri and in Illinois and in New York, and is finally killed, unfortunately, by an angry mob. And then Brigham Young picks up the pieces afterwards and moves the Mormon movement west to Utah, to the Great Salt Lake Basin, where they set up and become part of Mexico, actually, part of what is the growing Mexican empire there, and later on part of the western part of the United States. The next section is about abolitionism. Abolitionism was a highly controversial topic, obviously much more popular in the North than it was in the South for reasons that hopefully are pretty straightforward for you. But William Lloyd Garrison is the most ardent of the early abolitionists, I should say. William Lloyd Garrison believes that absolute end to slavery needs to happen today. Today. Okay? That the Constitution, because it allows slavery and doesn't specifically condemn it, is a pact with hell. That all of us are going to go and visit the devil as a result of slavery. So Garrison is a fiery abolitionist. He is ready to take on slavery and get rid of it as soon as we can. Theodore Weld is an early follower of Garrison who eventually breaks away from the American Anti-Slavery Society, the AASS, which was founded by Garrison, because they began to see Garrison as being too radical. Now, Garrison didn't just bring this idea of abolition, he also believed in complete female equality, and he was willing to go so far as to advocate anarchy, or the overthrow of the government, if that would bring about a society where there was no slavery. So a lot of people saw Garrison as being a good abolitionist, but too radical to be acceptable to mainstream America. Weld is going to combine with the Grimke sisters. The Grimkes are Quakers who have come from South Carolina, where their father owned a plantation, and have become sort of very zealous religious converts who come to the North in order to speak about abolition. And they use the same tactics as the Second Great Awakening. We're going to have these big tent revivals, and we're going to speak about Scripture. We're going to speak about God's message. We're going to use that sort of a forum to convince people of the virtues of abolition. We're going to have testimony from people who have seen it before, the Grimkes or other slaves as well, and it's going to be an opportunity to try and move people on the slave issue to get them convinced that abolitionism needs to occur. What kind of groups opposed the abolitionist movement? Well, obviously Southern slave owners opposed it. That's a pretty straightforward one. But then also Northern factory workers, because Northern factory workers saw slaves as possible competition. If 4 million African-American men and women suddenly were not slaves, they might be competition for factory jobs in the North. A lot of traditional clergymen didn't like the abolitionist movement itself because it so often relied upon women in leadership and speaking roles, and they would prefer not to see women out there speaking. Flipping the page, guys. We're on page 4. We're moving, man. Rolling. Okay. Discuss the contribution to the women's movement made by the following. I'll just try and say a few words about each of the people here, just the absolute basic what you need to know. Dorothea Dix advocated the reform of institutions and asylums, trying to get people to practice more humane treatment of people in those reform institutions. Horace Mann is not a woman, he's a man. Horace Mann. The rest of the people on the sheet are women, and sometimes we get that confused. But Horace Mann is an advocate for taxpayer-funded public education, believed that society needed to put its weight behind education for everybody. The Grimke sisters. We just talked about the Grimke sisters, but here we're going to mention that the Grimkes used their style and their tactics and also their opportunities where they spoke about abolition to then go on and speak about women's rights as well. So they're notable on both pages. Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. There's an apocryphal story that when Harriet Beecher Stowe meets President Lincoln says, "Oh, so you're the little lady who started this great war." In other words, saying that Uncle Tom's Cabin, which exposes the horrors and the inhumanity of slavery for a lot of Northern whites, was really one of the great causes, if you will, of the Civil War between the states. Now a few women associated with the real women's rights movement. Interestingly, it's almost the last issue that comes up. Women work for abolition, they work for temperance, they work for reform of institutions, and then they kind of get around to working for their own rights. Susan B. Anthony worked mostly for smaller pieces of legislation, what we'd call piecemeal stuff, trying to get legal equality, trying to get economic equality for women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Conference. You gotta know Seneca Falls. Seneca Falls Conference. At the Seneca Falls Conference in 1848, women and men gathered to declare the freedom and the equality of women, saying that they were supposed to be in a separate domestic sphere from men. They asked for complete equality for women. They issued what was called the Declaration of Sentiments that modeled the language of Jefferson in saying that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And that's an important point there. They also asked for the vote, as you can imagine. Flipping the page, we find Manifest Destiny. From here on out, we're really rolling down the slopes towards the point where the war is going to take place in 1860 and 1861 after the election of President Lincoln. So in a way, we're moving towards a more political dialogue. I'm going to go through this side of the sheet, and then I'm going to go to the third video as the last video. Manifest Destiny is the idea that Americans were bound to make their way across all of the American continent. Part of that is a puritanical religious drive. Part of it's an economic drive. There's a lot of good resources out there. And part of it is just something driven in the American soul from those first days at Jamestown. We have to go west. We have to go west. California, why are we going? A lot of good ports, a lot of cattle industry, eventually gold, good soil. Biggest problem, it's owned by Mexico. Oregon, again, good ports, especially for trade with China. Wonderful soil, great climate, opportunity for settlement there. It's owned by us and Britain in a sense. Both of us claim it as being our own. Define these terms associated with the 1844 elections. 54-40. The Democratic candidate James Polk said that we would either go to war with Britain in order to assure the parallel of 54 degrees 40 minutes as the border between Canada and American Oregon, or else. It was going to happen, right? 54-40 or fight. Okay. Unfortunately, when he finally does get elected, Polk turns around on that stance and renegotiates the line at 49 degrees, where it sits today. The line between what we know as British Columbia and Washington is at 49 degrees. But Polk had said that we would go to war for it. We didn't. The annexation of Texas. Once Polk wins his election, President Tyler, looking to sort of hang something on his hat, or hang his hat on something, I beg your pardon, and have a great claim for his presidency, admits Texas to the Union, which had been highly controversial before that. The biggest outsider in this election, the one that sort of stands out as being the newbie, is the Liberty Party's candidate, James Birney. The Liberty Party is an issue party. In other words, they have one real solid issue, and that issue is abolition of slavery right now. They only get about 2% of the vote. 60,000 Americans vote for the Liberty Party, but it's a sign that that's the growing issue of the day. The more we talk about expansion, the more we talk about war, the more we have to talk about slavery. The next question asks us how we engineered a war with Mexico. Polk made sure that we ended up in a war with Mexico so that we could take the lands of the Mexican cession. That's the lands of the American Southwest. We did that really by offering to buy it first, and then when that didn't work, we put troops into disputed territory between what we thought and what Mexico thought the boundaries of Texas and Mexico were. and when a skirmish took place, Polk could claim that we'd been attacked on U.S. sovereign soil, and the rest is kind of history as we head towards the Mexican-American War in the late 1840s. In our next session, we're going to start with the Wilmot Proviso, and we're going to roll from 1850 to 1860. If you're looking to do well on the DBQ next week, Monday in class, that video is going to be crucial. Take care, folks.